Hello. In this session, we're going to be talking about the storage hierarchy and disk technology. Performance is always driven by latency and bandwidth. The farther away you get from the CPU, the higher the latency of the components, but also the larger the capacity of those components as well. This leads to the idea of a storage hierarchy. In this hierarchy, what we see is that towards the top of this pyramid, we find the most expensive but the fastest components. And toward the bottom, we find the least expensive but the highest capacity components. So CPU registers are very fast but very expensive. They also don't have much storage at all. Cache is bigger but slightly slower. Main memory is slower yet, but much more capacity than the CPU registers. After this, we tend to find things like solid-state storage, such as flash or solid-state disks. Then we find magnetic disks, hard drives. We find optical disks toward the bottom. And finally, magnetic tape, which is the slowest, but can contain massive amounts of information. At the very top, we find all of these things, the CPU registers and the cache, in the CPU itself. Main memory is referred to as primary storage, and anything below main memory is considered secondary storage. Some of these layers exist strictly to cache lower layers. So, for instance, the static RAM that exists between the CPU and main memory exists only to cache the data below it. Other layers, such as dynamic RAM, can set aside a portion of themselves as cache. So, for example, it's not unusual for an operating system to provide a cache in main memory for the disk. Speaking of disks, let's talk about disk technology. The terminology here is what's important. A platter in a magnetic disk is the spinning portion of the disk. It's made out of glass or aluminum, and it's coated with magnetic media. You can see a picture of this here. The head then floats above the media and reads or writes the magnetic media, use the encoded data on the magnetic media. A track is a single ring on a platter. A cylinder then is a set of tracks across all platters because these disks can be stacked on top of one another, 2 or even 3 high. A sector is a wedge-shaped slice of a platter, and then a block is at the intersection of a single track and a sector. The seek time is the time that it takes to move the head to the desired track. So this is the disk head moving forward and backward. The latency time is the time that it takes to rotate the disk to a particular sector to be under the head. The transfer time then is once that rotation takes place, how long does it take to actually transfer that one block of data? There are 2 ways that the disk can be spun. There's what's called constant angular velocity, which is used by hard drives, in which the disk always spins at the same speed. Unfortunately, this wastes space on the outer rings. Constant linear velocity, on the other hand, encodes more bits at the outer rings and therefore has to spin slower out at that location. Toward the inner rings, it speeds up so that it can read the same number of bits per second. And so if you hear your optical disk spinning faster and slower, this is what it's doing. Disks often fail because they're at least partly mechanical. And so we often combine a redundant array of independent disks together to improve the redundancy and the bandwidth of our data transfers. So these combine 3 primary functions in RAID: mirroring, striping, and parity checks. RAID level 0 is striping. In this particular instance, we show 6 disks. Byte 1 is in the first disk, byte 2 is in the second disk, byte 3 is in the third disk, and so on. Once we've hit the 6th byte, we wrap back around to the first one. And so what we're going to be able to do is spread out our I/O requests across many different disks. This is very similar to memory interleaving. Unfortunately, if one of these disks fails, then we lose the entire stripe. RAID 1 then is what's called mirroring. In mirroring, we have disks that are paired with one another to produce mirror images. And so the first byte is written on both disk 1 and disk 2. The second byte is on disk 1 and disk 2, and so on. The 5th byte is on the second mirror. The 9th byte is on the third mirror. And in this case, we can lose up to half the disks. We could lose disk 1, disk 3, and disk 5, and we will still have all of our data. So mirroring doesn't improve bandwidth, it improves redundancy. RAID 5 then is striping with what's called distributed parity. So we're going to stripe all our data across the disks as well, but we're going to set aside space on each disk for what's called a parity check. A parity check allows us to check the status of the contents of the other disks in the stripe. And if any of those disks can fail, we can use the parity check to recreate the disk that failed. So under RAID 5, with this particular setup, we can lose a single disk and still recreate its contents, but we also get the efficiency of a stripe. And then finally, we have RAID 1.0, which is a stripe across mirrors. Again, in this case, we mirror our disks in pairs, but then we form a stripe across all of those mirrors. And this has the highest bandwidth and the best redundancy that's available to us, but we lose essentially the contents of half of our disks. We just don't have that storage available to us anymore. In summary, the memory hierarchy is going to show the inverse relationship between speed and capacity in computing systems. Magnetic disks have several kinds of latency: seek time, rotational delay, and transfer time, as well as a lot of other terminology that we've looked at. And finally, RAID attempts to compensate for latency and failures by employing striping, mirroring, and parity checking.